My name is Terry Nelson, and I'm a closed record domestic private agency adoptee from California. And I was adopted during the baby scoop era. And probably not many of those phrases mean a lot to you. So I'm going to try and explain in this video what the baby scoop era actually was. And I'm also going to explain why I'm painting what I'm painting. This painting shows a cat wearing a little crucifix on its collar, and it's clearly just eaten a bird and is hiding an egg. And if you've watched any of my other videos, you'll know that I usually use a cuckoo as a symbol for my biological mother. And in this particular painting, I'm represented as the cuckoo's egg. And the cat is my stand-in for the adoption agencies. So, what was the baby scoop era? The baby scoop was a period in the history of adoption that took place mostly in the United States, but also in all of the Commonwealth countries. It began just after World War II, around 1946, 1947-ish. And it lasted until about the mid-70s. What it was in a nutshell was a giant surge in the number of babies being born out of wedlock, and a corresponding surge in it becoming big business for adoption agencies to take the babies from unmarried women and to accept money from infertile couples in order to place the babies with them instead. There were a couple of things that lined up that made it possible for there to be a big boom in the population of babies being born to people that could not or did not want to care for them. After World War II, the soldiers began to return, and there was a corresponding economic boom in the United States. There was also a loosening in some of the social mores that really looked down on premarital sex. Although a lot of sex was being had, the pill hadn't been invented yet. Abortion wasn't legal, and condoms only have about an 87% chance of working. That's a 13% failure rate. Those figures are from the National Institute of Health from a 2010 survey. For what it's worth, the National Institute of Health says that even now, less than half, about 42% of the men that they surveyed, even knew how to put a condom on correctly. So, lots of sex, no birth control, a pretty puritanical viewpoint still on women who might be having sex outside of marriage. And that means there were a lot of scared, young, poor women pregnant and trying to figure out what they were going to do with themselves. If they didn't want to find themselves railroaded into an possibly unsuitable marriage, or they didn't have any kind of family support, then there weren't a lot of options for them. One option that did present itself quite readily, though, was adoption. From 1940 to 1970, an estimated 4 million mothers surrendered their babies to adoption. It was presented as the only solution to a problem. And I was one of the problems. So, was a profit being turned by the agencies in the unwed mothers' homes of the era? It would seem so. In addition to fees being paid by the prospective adoptive parents, many of the agencies also ran maternity homes for unwed mothers. The pregnant women would be required to work there for their room and board. The homes themselves were nonprofits, frequently funded by the state. And the babies were legally required to be boarded for at least a month following their birth, ostensibly so the mother could change her mind. But it also meant that the homes were compensated by the state for the care provided to the babies as foster care. Often, in order to convince an unwed mother that she needed to give her baby to the agency, they would set her up with a whole battery of psychological tests and interviews with social workers. At the time, it was very common for unwed mothers to be considered neurotic or in some way mentally unfit to raise their own babies just because they had gotten pregnant in the first place. In fact, it wasn't unheard of for women to be institutionalized if they refused to sign the relinquishment papers. During her pregnancy, an unmarried woman often went to a special home for her to wait out her pregnancy. In return for room, board, and payment of the hospital fees when she gave birth, she would have been counseled to sign the paperwork to relinquish the new baby. The adoption agencies themselves often ran some of these homes, and they also, in the case of the one that I came from, subcontracted with homes run by a variety of religious groups, Catholic Charities being one, in order to keep the supply of healthy babies coming in. So an unmarried woman in a maternity home would have been forced to carry her pregnancy to term. She would have had no rights on how the birth would proceed and often have been put under anesthesia and told to sign papers when she was just waking up from twilight. And she would have had no choice about raising the baby herself. The baby's father, on the other hand, was free to carry on with his life with no social stigma. Although he wouldn't have had to deal with the social stigma, he also had absolutely no rights towards the child. It wasn't until the 80s that fathers' rights were even considered at all in the course of an adoption proceedings. Adoption was heavily marketed at the time as being a win-win sort of situation. The baby wouldn't be illegitimate, the woman could get a fresh start, and a more worthy couple could raise their babies. The homes catered their services not really to the frightened young pregnant women, but instead to the overwhelmingly white upper or middle class adoptive parents who were assured that everything would be kept secret and that the baby's illegitimacy was never going to get out. By the mid-70s, the baby scoop era began to dry up a bit. The pill had been invented, and it was possible for even teenagers to get the pill. And Roe versus Wade had gone through, so abortion was now legal. And this meant that the domestic supply of infants began to dry up a little bit. It meant that the agencies then started to look into international adoptions, and that's when you begin to see the rise of international adoptions. Maybe the domestic baby scoop era is over for good, but I'm going to leave you with a quote from Justice Sam Alito's 98-page draft opinion reversing Roe versus Wade in 2022. He included the following footnote on page 34. In 2002, more than 1 million people were seeking to adopt babies, whereas the domestic supply of infants relinquished at birth or within the first month of life and available to be adopted has become virtually non-existent.